Welcome back. So we are having a very great conversation with Keith Cambron, former president and CTO of AT&T Labs. And let's continue with the Q&A session that we were having. So now let's talk a little bit about your personal experience at Bell Labs, which is a legendary institution. Tara Young has a question for you. The innovation at Bell Labs is famous. What are the cultural practices do you think that helped shape the lab's ability to inspire and foster innovation? And how have you tried to continue that culture?
Well, okay. So here comes a statement I've made to technology forums and customers around the world. Bell Labs was never terribly good at innovation. Bell Labs was good at invention. Invention and innovation are two entirely different things, and people use the words interchangeably, but they are not. The transistor is an invention. The laser is an invention. The C programming language, the charge-coupled device that is in all the digital cameras we use, those all came out of Bell Labs. And so they were really great, and Bell Labs is still around. Lucent Alcatel owns them. Was really the premier inventor in the say from 1940, and outside of IBM's Watson Lab did great work as well. So those are industrial laboratories. Bell Labs wasn't so great at innovation. Innovation is taking technology that's well understood and putting it together in a way that you can offer a service. So look at all the websites that are springing up in Silicon Valley. Those are innovations, but there's virtually no invention going on at those particular companies. There is invention going on in other places in Silicon Valley. So make that distinction. AT&T Labs, we were really more in the innovation camp than we were in the invention camp. I didn't have any material sciences. Nobody was working on silicon. I didn't have people doing theoretical physics. We had 200 researchers, but they were applying research to network problems. There were some good inventions that came out of there. The largest databases that the world has ever seen were actually being used in AT&T Labs 10, 15 years ago. And it's called the Daytona database system. Larger than Oracle. Oracle couldn't hold the data that we had. So in selective areas, visualization technology, so there's certain areas where we did have a right to claim invention, but largely we had a continuous stream of innovation that were used. Not only some of it went to subscribers, but it made the network run a lot better. So in some sense, it was invisible to the consumer.
So the second question that Tara has is actually something that was in the news recently. I read an article in Wall Street Journal about the president's visit to Cedar Falls Utilities. So Tara wants to know, with the president's recent trip to Iowa to promote Cedar Falls Utilities fiber network and the new FCC rules defining high speeds for broadband, what do you think is the future for fiber deployment, especially in municipal settings?
Well, I've watched this over the years. The first municipality I saw deploy their own broadband network goes back, gosh, I think into the early 80s, Palo Alto, California, where Stanford's located, and of course Silicon Valley, built their own cable network because they, I guess, got frustrated with the cable provider. San Leandro, California has built their own fiber loop and actually has done pretty well with it. But I really take issue with the president holding that up as a model for how we're going to get broadband across the United States. In general, municipalities have a whole set of problems, and competing with cable companies, telcos, and wireless providers, one would have to question whether that ought to be at the top of their list. Setting that aside, they're free to compete. You're not going to put broadband at 100 megabits per second in 150 million homes by having a pumpkin sitter Center, Missouri, I'm from Missouri, go out and build a fiber network. If you take that approach and you have a belief that that's the right thing to do, as this administration does, and then you impose Title II and net neutrality, you may get your wish, because the carriers may leave the business. And so unless Pumpkin Center wants to build their own fiber network, the residents in Pumpkin Center may not get one. So I just don't understand, if you truly want to get 100 megabits per second deployed ubiquitously, there has to be an incentive for investment to go do that. And the municipalities, you'll have a few of them, like San Leandro, California, that did a good job. But for every one of those, I can point to municipal bankruptcies where cities got into businesses they shouldn't be in. And there's scores of those. So I just think that was a bad idea to go do that. Having said that, I can assure you Lowell McAdam, the CEO of Verizon, and Randall Stevenson, the CEO of AT&T, don't lie awake at night worrying that the Cedar Falls out there are going to cut into their business.
So Keith, in an earlier part of the interview, you mentioned about separating out the discussions of net neutrality from that of Title II. So Robert Headley has a question about net neutrality, so maybe we can get into that discussion now. So Robert asks, what are your views on net neutrality in general, and the announcement from Tom Wheeler that he intends to regulate ISPs under Title II. So since we discussed the Title II already, let's hear your views about net neutrality.
Yeah, so there are two sides, again, to net neutrality, and I've touched on them in other comments. There's the economic side. Content providers don't want to pay to deliver content. And I've talked about the implications of that subscribers are going to pay the full rate, and we're going to reach a point where we can no longer scale the network if content providers don't pay something towards the transport. And again, we get to this location where content providers build huge data centers in the center of the country and expect the content to be carried all over the world. South America, Google has one data center. Somebody's got to carry that content all over South America. Now, they may use Akamai or other techniques, but it's a real problem. So the economics is one issue, and I've talked about that quite a bit. On the technology side, I've touched on that as well. We have the word discrimination has become a very negative word in our lexicon, to use the word discrimination. What does discrimination mean? It means to make a choice. Now, in 100 years of our history, choices were made based on the basis of people's skin or the language they spoke or other bases. That tainted the word discrimination. In networks, discrimination is a good thing. We need to discriminate between various classes of traffic. I worked with enterprise companies in the Fortune 500. I looked at many of their networks. I talked to their telecommunications chief technical officers. Every network out there running has 6 to 8 classes of service. If you're sending a bulk file transfer, it just has to get through eventually. So it's a very low class of service. If you're on a VoIP phone call, a voice over IP phone call, that needs to get there within 50 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds. It has to have a very high class of service. If it's a protocol message that may save the network from failing, you need to get that message delivered. So you need to discriminate. You need to make choices in your network. Net neutrality prevents all discrimination because the discrimination carries with it the stigma, which doesn't apply to networks at all. So you can't discriminate in any way, fashion, or form. If you go look at the FCC's network, when you go work at the FCC and you sit down at a desk and you look at how you get to the internet and what your network looks like, guess what? It has 6 classes of service. It has access control lists. It has all the things that the FCC is telling the subscriber they should not have. So if these classes of service and access control lists and all the other mechanisms are so bad and subscribers should not have them, why does the FCC have them? Why does Google use them? Do you think Google is going to build a network with that class of service? So the technology side of net neutrality, we're talking about all the wrong things. I wish I could get together with the engineers at Google and say, don't you want web real-time communications? Don't you want to be able to pick in your application which data structures and what type of data gets priority over what other type? Wouldn't you like voice and perhaps some critical streaming video to have priority over mail delivery and bulk file transports? Isn't that a capability that would be very useful to browsers and real-time communications? But they can't say that publicly because the content side of their business has to get behind the net neutrality bandwagon. So it's a very unfortunate discussion. It's the wrong discussion, but that's the one we're having.
So one of the aspect of net neutrality discussion is about paid prioritization of traffic. What are your thoughts about paid prioritization? Do you think that is going to have some implications for the consumers or for the content providers or the internet ecosystem in general?
Well, so we pay for that. Subscribers pay for that today. I've got 50 megabits per second coming to my home. If I were willing to live with 20 megabits per second, I would pay less. So the idea of paying for performance is not a new idea. The people that argue against, quote, fast lanes are the content providers again, because they don't want to pay anything. But the way I think about this is, let's start and talk about the best technical solution. And then if we can agree on that, the content providers, the carriers, and the subscribers or subscribers' representatives, whoever they might be, if we can all agree on what constitutes the best network or a good network, let's agree on that, then we need to figure out who pays for it and how. If we don't come up with an economic solution where everybody profits, it's never going to get built. So we need to do that. But certainly it doesn't seem right to me that companies that fill half the internet believe they have the right to pay nothing. But if there are services out there that don't need speeds, mail services, file transfer, and so forth, then they shouldn't, if the latency is an issue, if the delivery is not an issue for them, they should be able to pay less. If you send something in the post, U.S. government, good old post office, if you send it express, they're going to charge you more. Is that fair? I don't know, but it seems to be, and people seem to accept that. But somehow, the idea of express mail is acceptable, but somehow the idea of express bits coming to your home is not. So I don't understand.
Now let's get back to the discussion that we were having earlier about Comcast and Time Warner. So Robert has a question for you. What do you think about the Comcast Time Warner merger? Do you think that this will harm the consumers, or do you side with their argument that they don't serve the same consumers and therefore this will be a net positive for the market? Your thoughts?
Okay, so let me begin by looking, because Robert should distinguish a little more in the question. And here's what I mean by that. So the Comcast Time Warner merger is what we're considering, and whether it will, quote, harm consumers or not. So what does he mean by harm? Does he mean, will the prices go up? Will the choices decrease? Will the performance degrade? Will broadband be slower? Will service be worse? Will he wait longer if he has to call a service rep? So when you say harm, it would be helpful to know, are you worried about price, performance, or maybe he's worried about the whole basket of the things I mentioned. And then the second question is when Comcast, if I just take Comcast for the moment, they provide multiple services. So what aspect are you assigning to, what aspects are you assigning to harm, what attributes? And then which service are you talking about? Because Comcast provides broadband service, they're an internet service provider, they provide subscription TV service, and they provide phone service. And they provide a lot of other services, but let's stay with those three. Again, going back to the legal question, because we shouldn't make judgments about mergers based on some emotion around whether we feel somebody's going to be hurt or not. We need to base it on law. And the law, and it's stood the test since Theodore Roosevelt was president, the Sherman Antitrust Act and the common law associated with it. Again, the same criteria is, do they have at least 50% of the market? If they don't, we shouldn't even be worrying about it. If we look at subscription TV service, Comcast in many markets competes with a telephone company, Fios, or AT&T's UVerse. They compete with DirecTV, they compete with Dish TV, and they compete with over-the-top providers. So I get my television off the air, we've got HD antennas, and through the internet, Netflix, Hulu, and everything else. So Comcast is competing with all of those. So they have at least 4 other competitors in the subscription TV market. There are places where Comcast doesn't have as intense competition, but they probably don't have over 40% of the market, even where they're doing very well, maybe 50% some places. So you can't say because of subscription TV that they're in violation of antitrust. Broadband, there are many places where there are only 2 providers, in some places only 1. So you could make an argument that there are places where broadband has Comcast over 50% of the market. Nowhere in any of those areas, as far as I know, have Comcast and Time Warner overbuilt each other. So they're not competitors in the markets they serve. And I think that's Comcast's argument. So broadband, they don't compete. For voice, my gosh, a subscriber that gets voice from Comcast, they have AT&T, landline, for example, AT&T Wireless, Verizon Wireless, Sprint Wireless, T-Mobile, you go on and on and on. There's so many competitors in voice. The only argument you can make about them being in violation of antitrust is in broadband, and you can't argue that Comcast and Time Warner have the same customers going to be affected by the merger. The reason this is going to generate a lot of press is because there is someone who will be, quote, harmed in a Comcast Time Warner merger. Who is that? I'll answer my own question. It's the people who bring you the nightly news. The people who put the merger up in front of you and say, look what's happening. When Comcast and Time Warner merge, they will be able to negotiate from a very powerful position with the broadcast networks and with content providers. So the nightly talk shows, the newscasters, all potentially, not necessarily, potentially will be in a weakened position to negotiate, and therefore their revenues might go down. So lesson for your students, anytime you see anything in the public around any of these issues where there's an impassioned speech, ask yourself, where is the money? Where does the money go? Who gets it? And are the people telling me the story, whether it's a financial analyst or the nightly news, do they have a stake in the outcome of this? And might that prejudice their point of view? So from my vantage point, and I don't have any stock in any of those companies, and I have actually a small portion of my portfolio is in AT&T now, not a large portion. I think they have to apply the antitrust laws, and I think if they do that, except in broadband, they have a very hard time pointing to any violation of antitrust. Remember, as I said earlier, Google has 85% of the search market. And somehow they figured out antitrust doesn't apply to them. But if you believe it applies to Comcast, then shouldn't you go back and revisit Google?
So, Keith, Ezra Henson has a question. How has your business model changed with recent developments in cloud computing, in sponsored data, etc.? Where do you see this going in the future?
Well, so cloud computing to me is a long-term trend. And I mentioned the fact that I thought browsers were going to get a lot more capable. I think we could see a substantial shift in the capability of browsers if we get IPv6, if we get class of service to the subscriber's home, and some of the other technology innovations I mentioned, like web real-time communications. What cloud computing done? By the way, virtualization didn't start with VMware and virtual computing. Virtualization started with networks. Virtual networks, the idea of putting multiple networks over a single communications channel, started 20 years before. So we virtualized communications with virtual private networks. We virtualized computing with VMware. And now we've virtualized IT services via cloud computing. So what that does for businesses, and it has turned IBM, HP, and Oracle's businesses on their ear. You no longer need huge IT departments with thousands of servers in an enterprise. You can simply rent computing and rent software services rather than having to have large staffs and have this constant issues of security and the constant turnover. Certainly virtual computing and virtual storage make it far more economic to scale, hence Amazon's web services. So that's really changed the industry dramatically. But what it does is place far more emphasis on high-speed networks. Because if you're doing all your work in the cloud, every time you do a key click or every time you type, we have to get the latency down to the point where you get the response you need. So the cloud has to be fast, it has to be high bandwidth, has to be 100% reliable. So we're putting a lot more onus on the networks. The networks are capable of this if we can continue to fund the capital to build them and have them keep up with the demands of cloud services. So net neutrality in Title II don't put that at risk for businesses, because businesses will continue to operate under a contractual basis. It just says the subscribers, the consumer, can never tap into all of that because they'll be regulated under Title II. And the businesses will simply write direct contracts with the subscribers and do their best to avoid Title II. So the only loser will be the consumer. The businesses in cloud is unstoppable at this time, and that trend will continue.
So, well, Keith, what do you think about new pricing practices? Do you see a lot of new pricing practices that might be taking place in the United States if we were not to regulate ISPs as per Title II or apply a much stricter version of net neutrality? Do you think we would be seeing dynamic pricing, app-based pricing, and other variations of that?
Well, so philosophically, I'm a free market capitalist. So if you tell me there's a danger out there, advertisement-based content or any other danger you might cite that is associated with the consumer and the internet and the innovation that's taking place, I would say that the consumers in the marketplace are much smarter and better able to deal with that than the government is. The government, if you look at the history of regulation, what you end up with is the government, people are good and have good intentions when they write regulations, but the businesses that can profit from leveraging those regulations and those regulators in particular end up winning at the cost of others. And I can cite case after case after case. When you go to fill up your car today, you're going to put something in your car called ethanol. And ethanol was a regulation that was passed with good intentions to clean the environment. Guess what? It creates more carbon dioxide than gasoline does when you take everything into account. So there's a regulation that was passed with good intentions of making our environment cleaner, renewable energy source, but the renewable energy advocates didn't know that we're going to have an energy boom in this country. Yet we're awash in oil. We're still taking corn and making ethanol. Why are we doing that? Well, because a regulation was passed and there are two strong lobbying groups that want to have ethanol placed in your cars. The people that grow corn is one of them. And so regulations get passed with good intentions, but in the end, they're manipulated by lobbyists many times, not always. We need to be very thankful for the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act that were passed back in the 60s, and those are wonderful things. But be careful of trying to regulate technology, because technology needs to grow and evolve. If the marketplace and the consumer, who are very smart at the end of the day, will solve these problems themselves, and if you get a company that abuses their trust, they will quickly turn on that company. Let them try to solve it. We need regulations, but they are the last choice of how to solve egregious mistreatment of the consumer. They should not be a first choice, particularly not for a problem that we've never seen, like blocking sites on the internet.
Well, Keith, it was a very insightful discussion, and it was wonderful talking to you today. Once again, thank you very much for joining us today.
Soumya, thank you, and particular thanks to your students. It was a great pleasure, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, thank you, viewers. Thanks for joining us today, and keep your eyes open for new such series of talks to come over the course of time. Thank you.